Like and subscribe and click the bell icon to get new video updates.
Wwii nurse Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Bullwinkel'S incredible tale of survival in 1942, on the shore of Radji Beach, in what is now Indonesia. 26-year-old nurse Vivian Bullwinkel stood with the tropical ocean lapping at her nurse's uniform, listening to the cry of seagulls and wondering about her brother John, who was in the RAAF. She was savouring the last moments of her life. Sister Bullwinkel and 21 other Australian nurses had a contingent of the Japanese army at their backs, who had walked the young women into the water at bayonet point. Behind her, the Japanese soldiers had set up Tommy guns and a machine gun. They fired a stream of bullets along the line, aiming for each woman's heart. As we were thigh-deep in the surf, they opened murderous fire, mowing us down like a scene I saw in a film as a child, Sister Bullwinkel told the Age newspaper in 1945. Women around me shrieked, stiffened and sank. Sister Bullwinkel floated amongst them, but much to her surprise, she was not dead. They lived for service. Sister Bullwinkel ended up a lieutenant colonel, but before receiving those honors, she would have to survive insurmountable horrors until the end of the war in 1945. Most of the people she met along the way didn't make it and are remembered through her testament. It is an astonishing tale that was documented by author Ian Shaw in his book On Radji Beach, the story of Australian nurses after the fall of Singapore. She lived a wonderful life, Mr Shaw said. It is a surprising summary of a woman who was aboard an evacuation ship sunk at sea, had survived on a tropical island, witnessed a massacre, stood in a firing line and endured over 3 years as a prisoner of the Japanese army. When I was doing the research, I had access to a lot of the letters of Vivian's nursing colleagues and friends, Mr Shaw said. They were just the most selfless and unbelievably positive human beings. They lived for service. Mr Shaw never met Lieutenant Colonel Bullwinkel, but through his research has garnered a sense of her character. Vivian was that kind of woman. She could accept what life was throwing at her and she didn't appear to have any regrets, Mr Shaw said. She would have been close to the highest-ranking woman in the Australian Army when she retired from miliary service. The horror began on Friday 13. Lieutenant Colonel Bullwinkel was born in 1915 in South Australia. She spent her childhood in Kapunda and grew to be taller than most. She had a warm, genuine smile and did well in country towns, training as a nurse in Broken Hill, then beginning her career in Hamilton, Victoria. She enlisted in 1941, as soon as she was 25, and was assigned to the February 13 Australian General Hospital. They sailed for Singapore in September 1941. Mr Shaw said when Pearl Harbour was bombed, everything changed for the Allies stationed in the Pacific, which was fast coming under the control of the Japanese. There were a lot of casualties amongst all the Allied forces, and about 10 days before the surrender, senior command began discussing evacuating the nurses, he said. Lieutenant Colonel Bullwinkel was evacuated on the Vyner Brooke, which had 181 people on board, mostly women and children. They sailed, believe it or not, on Friday 13 and were sunk the next day by Japanese aircraft off Bangka Island, Mr Shaw said. He said while there was no Red Cross on display, like a hospital ship would have had, it would have been clear to Japanese aircraft that this was an evacuation ship, thanks to the efforts of the brave nurses. When the Japanese aircraft approached, a number of the nurses would go up on deck and wave. They had quite a distinctive uniform, but the aircraft that sunk the Vyner Brooke just attacked it, he said. It was 2 p.m. when the ship sunk. Many people were wounded and killed, but the Australian War Memorial recorded that around 150 survivors made it ashore at Bangka Island, after swimming for sometimes 8, and up to 65 hours. For many, the fate awaiting them was worse than drowning, as the island was occupied by the Japanese army. Standing tall in the line of fire, the Vyner Brooke survivors gathered on Radji Beach and lit a bonfire, then tried to decide what to do next. They couldn't survive there, Mr Shaw said. There was fresh water, a small spring, but food was going to be a problem. A number of people had been wounded in the sinking of the ship. Mr. Shaw describes how a small delegation was sent to the nearest town of Moontok to surrender, and that party survived, but it triggered a series of cold-blooded and deliberate massacres. The Japanese sent what I believe was a fighting patrol, 16 men, who were sent back to Radji Beach, and they took no prisoners, Mr. Shaw said. The first thing was to separate the officers from the civilians, and they took them behind a small headline and bayoneted them to death there. Mr. Shaw said the remaining women,